On March 11, 2025, the world witnessed a stunning diplomatic reversal. Just days after a catastrophic White House meeting where an American president publicly berated a wartime leader, Ukraine agreed to a proposal that could potentially shift the entire trajectory of the three-year conflict with Russia. The abrupt suspension of American weapons had left Ukraine facing imminent battlefield collapse. Yet within 2 weeks, Ukraine managed to not only restore vital military aid but also seize the moral high ground by embracing a ceasefire proposal that now puts Vladimir Putin in a diplomatic corner. How did Ukraine navigate this precarious diplomatic minefield? And what happens if Russia rejects peace? The relationship between Ukraine and the United States has been the linchpin of Ukraine's survival strategy since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. When that alliance publicly fractured on February 28, with President Trump accusing President Zelensky of not wanting peace before ejecting the Ukrainian delegation from the White House, many analysts predicted Ukraine's imminent collapse. What unfolded instead was a masterclass in crisis diplomacy that has transformed Ukraine's position from supplicant to peace advocate. The stakes couldn't be higher. Ukraine's territorial integrity, Russia's expansionist ambitions, and America's credibility as a global power all hang in the balance. Two competing narratives emerged. Was Ukraine stubbornly prolonging a war it couldn't win, or was Russia's refusal to engage in good-faith negotiations the real obstacle to peace? This documentary examines the factual evidence behind the diplomatic breakthrough and what it means for global security. To understand the current diplomatic maneuvering, we must first recognize the path that led to this moment. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 followed 8 years of limited conflict in eastern Ukraine after Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. American military support, initially hesitant under the Biden administration, gradually expanded to include increasingly sophisticated weapon systems and intelligence sharing. This Western backing allowed Ukraine to halt Russia's initial advance and even reclaim significant territory in late 2022. However, by 2024, with Russian forces grinding forward and Ukrainian troops facing ammunition shortages, battlefield momentum had shifted. The Trump administration, which took office in January 2025, immediately signaled a more transactional approach to Ukraine support. The Trump administration viewed continued support as wasteful spending without clear American benefits. Ukraine saw the shift as abandonment after sacrificing lives to defend democratic values. The Kremlin interpreted the policy change as vindication of its strategy to outlast Western resolve. The breaking point came during President Zelensky's February visit to Washington, where a televised disagreement devolved into what Colonel Pavlo Polisa described as a shouting match. The immediate result was a suspension of American weapons deliveries and critical battlefield intelligence. Rather than continuing to negotiate in Washington's charged political environment, the reconciliation meeting was moved to neutral ground in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, a setting typically used for talks between rivals, not allies. The diplomatic breakthrough must be understood through multiple lenses, as each key player operates with different priorities and constraints. For Ukraine, the imperative was clear: restore American support without surrendering sovereignty. Prior to the March 11th agreement, President Zelensky had consistently rejected any ceasefire without explicit security guarantees, fearing Russia would use a pause to rearm. By accepting the 30-day proposal, Ukraine demonstrated flexibility while shifting pressure to Russia. As Colonel Polisa stated, "Over the last 3 weeks the media has been saying that Ukraine doesn't want peace. Now we've proven that's not true." Within the Trump administration, competing factions have shaped policy toward Ukraine. Vice President J.D. Vance, historically skeptical of Ukraine's support, reportedly influenced the White House confrontation. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, both traditional defense hawks, played central roles in the Jeddah negotiations. The administration's focus on American interests has manifested in demands for economic concessions, particularly regarding Ukraine's critical mineral resources. Vladimir Putin has maintained maximalist demands throughout the conflict, including the annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces, Ukrainian neutrality, military reductions, and NATO withdrawal from much of Eastern Europe. With Russian forces slowly advancing, and Ukraine's Kursk incursion creating domestic political pressures, Putin faces a complex decision: reject the ceasefire, and risk reinvigorated American support for Ukraine, or accept it, and potentially lose battlefield momentum. While Western media frames the ceasefire as a peace opportunity, Russian state media portrays it as a Western ploy to prevent inevitable Russian victory. On March 11th, following several hours of negotiations in Jeddah, Ukraine agreed to an American proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire, contingent on Russian reciprocation. The diplomatic process began with Ukraine presenting its partial ceasefire concept, focusing on halting aerial and naval attacks, before American negotiators countered with a more comprehensive 30-day, full ceasefire proposal, renewable by mutual agreement. The joint statement released after the talks confirmed several key elements: the immediate ceasefire proposal to be presented to Russia, discussions regarding humanitarian efforts during the ceasefire, including prisoner exchanges, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children, and a commitment to finalize a comprehensive agreement for developing Ukraine's critical mineral resources. Within hours of the agreement, American military officials confirmed that weapons deliveries and intelligence sharing would resume immediately. This represents a significant victory for Ukraine, regaining vital support without making territorial concessions. While presented as a breakthrough, the agreement leaves several critical questions unanswered. First, the security guarantees that Ukraine has long sought remain undefined. National Security Advisor Waltz acknowledged discussions about guarantees but offered no specifics. Second, the agreement makes no mention of Ukraine's NATO aspirations, which President Trump has publicly opposed. Third, the agreement doesn't address territorial questions, where Trump has previously stated Ukraine would not recover all lost territory. What makes this diplomatic maneuver particularly significant is that Ukraine has managed to transform its position from being portrayed as the obstacle to peace to positioning itself as the reasonable party waiting for Russia's response. As Eric Chiaramella of the Carnegie Endowment noted, a clean ceasefire benefits the Ukrainians. It would give them time to rest, and has the potential to put Russia on the back foot. The timing of the agreement coincided with a Ukrainian drone strike against Moscow that reportedly hit a refinery, demonstrating Ukraine's continued military capability despite American aid restrictions. This show of force may have strengthened Ukraine's negotiating position by proving it remained a capable adversary. The diplomatic developments between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States reverberate far beyond Eastern Europe, affecting security calculations and alliances worldwide. In Western Europe, the ceasefire proposal has catalyzed renewed defense coordination. France and Britain have emerged as critical players supporting Ukraine through this diplomatic crisis. On the same day as the Jeddah Agreement, French President Emmanuel Macron hosted military chiefs from more than 30 countries to discuss credible security guarantees for Ukraine. The most concrete proposal involves a European reassurance force of 20 to 30,000 troops that could deploy to Ukraine if a lasting ceasefire is achieved. This represents a significant shift in European security thinking, moving from dependence on American guarantees toward greater self-reliance, albeit with hoped-for American logistical support. In Asia, the diplomatic crisis has heightened concerns about American reliability among allies like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. These nations watch closely how the United States treats Ukraine, seeing potential parallels to their own security guarantees against regional powers. The agreement's emphasis on Ukraine's critical mineral resources adds a global economic dimension often overlooked in security discussions. Ukraine possesses significant deposits of lithium, titanium, and other minerals essential for renewable energy technologies and defense industries. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia's role as mediator represents its continued efforts to position itself as a diplomatic power broker beyond regional conflicts. By facilitating negotiations between Ukraine and the United States, Saudi leadership gains diplomatic capital with both Washington and European capitals. For millions of Ukrainian refugees across Europe, the ceasefire discussions offer the first glimmer of hope for potential return, even as the uncertainty of Russian response tempers expectations. As the diplomatic chess match continues, three primary scenarios emerge based on Russia's response to the ceasefire proposal. If Putin rejects the ceasefire outright, Ukraine would likely receive strengthened American support, potentially including previously restricted weapons systems. Secretary Rubio signaled this possibility by noting, "If they say no, then we'll unfortunately know what the impediment is to peace here." This scenario would reinforce the narrative that Russia, not Ukraine, is the obstacle to peace, potentially strengthening European resolve and isolating Russia further diplomatically. More likely than outright rejection, Putin might offer a modified proposal that accepts aspects of the ceasefire while introducing new conditions. This would create complex negotiating dynamics, testing the newfound alignment between Ukraine and the Trump administration. A partial Russian acceptance could divide Western allies, with some European nations potentially pressing Ukraine to accept compromises to avoid further bloodshed. The least likely but most transformative scenario would be Russia's full acceptance of the proposed 30-day ceasefire. This would immediately freeze the battlefield situation and open space for broader negotiations. Even with a mutually accepted ceasefire, significant challenges would remain, including verification mechanisms, handling of contested territories, and the framework for subsequent peace talks. Regardless of Russia's immediate response, the diplomatic initiative has reset negotiations and created new diplomatic space that didn't exist before the Jeddah talks. The diplomatic breakthrough between Ukraine and the United States demonstrates how quickly geopolitical dynamics can shift in times of crisis. What appeared to be a catastrophic rupture between allies has transformed into a coordinated diplomatic initiative that places responsibility for peace squarely on Russia's response. As Colonel Palisa observed, Ukraine has survived to fight another day, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. Yet the fundamental questions remain unresolved. What territorial configuration would constitute an acceptable peace? What security guarantees would prevent future aggression? And how will reconstruction be funded? The proposal's emphasis on economic development alongside security considerations points to a potential path forward, one where Ukraine's prosperity becomes as central to peace as its territorial integrity. As we await Russia's response to this ceasefire proposal, we must consider what constitutes a just peace when aggression has been rewarded with territorial gains. Is a frozen conflict preferable to continued bloodshed? The diplomatic maneuvering affects millions of lives: soldiers on the front lines, civilians under bombardment, families separated by conflict, and refugees scattered across Europe. Their futures hang in the balance of decisions made in Moscow, Washington, and Kyiv. At Omni, we'll continue tracking these diplomatic developments daily, providing analysis of Russia's response and what it means for global security as this situation evolves. Our team of regional experts delivers context that mainstream coverage often misses. As Ukraine demonstrates at both the negotiating table and on the battlefield, apparent defeat can transform into opportunity with skillful strategy. The question now is whether this diplomatic gambit will lead to genuine peace, or merely represent another move in a longer, more complex game. What seems certain is that this ceasefire proposal has changed the narrative, and in geopolitics, controlling the narrative is often half the battle.